A man shares a meal with a factory worker, only to discover the next day that he's actually a millionaire, and what happens next will shock you. His clothes were worn. His steel-toe boots had scuff marks, not the kind that came from fresh work, but from years of it. His lunch was the smallest in the room, a plain sandwich wrapped haphazardly in wax paper, sitting next to a small bottle of water. Daniel Carter had spent a decade inside the walls of Fulton Steel Factory, a place where time crawled under the weight of labor. His days were predictable, long hours spent operating heavy machinery, the sharp smell of metal in his lungs, and the ever-present hum of grinding steel that became so ingrained in his senses that even in his sleep he could still hear it. His body bore the years of wear, calloused hands, sore joints, an ache that never truly left, but he never complained. There was no point in it. Complaints were swallowed whole by the factory floor, unheard, unacknowledged. At 43, Daniel had long accepted his place in the pecking order. Promotions didn't come to men like him. He had no family name that carried weight, no powerful friends in management who could pull him up the ranks. He worked hard because it was all he knew. If luck ever decided to show itself, it had yet to knock on his door. The factory operated like a beast, loud, relentless, indifferent to the people who kept it alive. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of oil, the heat of machinery radiating off metal surfaces. The workers moved like parts of the assembly line itself, silent, mechanical, focused. They were replaceable, and they knew it. No one here wasted time on unnecessary talk. Conversations were short, functional. Friendships were rare, and any sign of weakness was ignored. By the time the lunch bell rang that Wednesday afternoon, Daniel barely felt the exhaustion. It was routine now, muscle memory. He wiped his hands on the coarse rag tucked into his waistband and made his way to the break room, a small, cramped space tucked into the far end of the factory. The break room was no different from the factory itself, dimly lit, overcrowded, filled with the same air of quiet resignation. A handful of rusted metal tables sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs, their surfaces scarred by years of careless use. The scent of reheated meals and sweat clung to the walls. Daniel settled into his usual spot near the vending machine, setting down his lunch, a simple meal packed in a worn brown paper bag. He never brought much. A couple of sandwiches, sometimes leftovers if his fridge had any. It was enough. He wasn't the type to complain. But today something caught his attention. At the far end of the room, near the door, sat a new worker. Daniel hadn't seen him before. The man looked older, late 50s, maybe even early 60s. His hair was streaked with gray, his skin marked with deep lines that spoke of years spent under hard labor. He didn't carry himself like the other men. There was something different, an unfamiliar presence in the way he sat, the way he watched the room rather than simply existing in it. The other workers paid him no mind. That was how it was here. New faces came and went, and the ones who stuck around long enough to matter were few. Daniel had seen it before, men who lasted a week, maybe two, before they realized they were just another pair of hands in a factory that would replace them the moment they slowed down. Daniel wasn't sure why, but something about the older man sitting alone didn't sit right with him. He had been in that position before, new, unknown, unnoticed. He knew what it felt like. Without much thought, he picked up his lunch tray and made his way across the room. The plastic chair scraped against the floor as he pulled it out and sat down across from the older man. The man looked up, startled, almost wary. He wasn't expecting company. Daniel didn't hesitate. He had never been the type to overthink things. He simply set his food down, unwrapped his sandwich, and ate. For a moment, the silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, but measured. The kind of quiet that existed when two people shared a space but weren't sure if words were necessary. Then, finally, Daniel spoke. "New here?" He kept his tone casual, not wanting to pry. The older man nodded, taking a slow bite of his sandwich. "Yeah, started yesterday." His voice was steady, yet distant, like someone who had spent years talking just enough to get by. Daniel didn't ask more. He knew better than to push. Some men carried pasts they weren't willing to share. Instead, he tore off a piece of his sandwich and set it on the man's tray without a word. The older man stilled, his gaze flicking to the offering before looking back at Daniel. There was something in his eyes, surprise, maybe even a hint of something deeper. "You didn't have to do that," the man said after a moment. Daniel shrugged. "Nobody should eat alone." The older man studied him for a second longer before picking up the piece of sandwich and taking a bite. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, as if tasting something beyond just food. For the remainder of lunch, the two men spoke in bits and pieces. Not much, just enough. They exchanged the usual small talk, discussions of the factory, past jobs, the way their backs ached after too many shifts. The older man introduced himself simply as Sam. No last name, no details, just Sam. He said he had worked in similar places before, though he didn't say where. His words were carefully chosen, measured, but Daniel didn't question it. He had met plenty of men who spoke little about their pasts. Some had nothing to say. Others had too much to hide. Either way, Daniel didn't press. As the break bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, Sam picked up his tray but hesitated before leaving. Then he looked at Daniel, a slight smile, barely there, crossing his face. "You're a good man." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Daniel to finish the last of his meal in silence. Daniel didn't think much of it, not until the next day. The next morning, Daniel Carter arrived at the Fulton Steel Factory the same way he always did, walking through the towering metal gates, breathing in the familiar scent of heated steel and motor oil, and preparing himself for another grueling shift. The air inside the factory carried its usual weight, thick with dust, damp with sweat, filled with the relentless clatter of machines pounding metal into shape. He went straight to his station, a massive press machine that had become an extension of his own body after 10 years of operating it. His hands found their familiar places, gripping the controls with the confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. The work was mindless, repetitive, but that was how Daniel liked it. It kept his thoughts from wandering. Barely an hour into his shift, the usual rhythm of his morning was interrupted. Footsteps approached from behind, heavy and deliberate, stopping just a few feet away. Before Daniel even turned around, he recognized the voice that followed. Mr. Graves. Graves had been a supervisor at Fulton Steel for longer than most could remember. He was a man built from factory work, with a face permanently carved into a scowl and a voice that had no patience for excuses. He never called workers by their first names, never bothered with pleasantries. If he was speaking to someone, it was either a warning, an order, or the kind of bad news that made men's stomachs sink. Graves didn't waste time. Carter needed to report to the main office, immediately. Daniel felt a strange, unexpected tension coil in his chest. The boss wanted to see him? He had never been summoned before. He wasn't the kind of worker who drew attention. He showed up, did his job, and left. No complaints, no mistakes, nothing that should have put him on the radar of anyone in the upper offices. He wiped his hands on the sides of his worn-out jeans, trying to shake off the sudden nervousness that settled into his gut. He could feel the eyes of his co-workers on him as he stepped away from his station, whispers passing between them like electricity through a wire. No one from the factory floor ever got called to the boss's office, not unless something serious had happened. Daniel made his way through the long, winding corridors that separated the factory floor from the administrative side of the building. It was a place he had never set foot in before, a place meant for men who wore suits instead of steel-toed boots. The deeper he walked into it, the more foreign everything became. The air smelled different, cleaner, untouched by the grime of labor. The walls weren't stained with years of industrial work. They were pristine, lined with framed photographs and plaques Daniel had never cared to read. By the time he reached the main office doors, his palms were damp. A secretary barely glanced at him before motioning for him to enter. Daniel stepped inside. The room was massive. It felt like a different world entirely. Polished wood floors, bookshelves stacked neatly along the walls, a towering window that stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a sprawling view of the city beyond. The sunlight pouring through the glass cast sharp beams across an expensive leather chair, one that sat behind an enormous desk made of dark mahogany. And there, seated in that chair, was Sam. Only it wasn't Sam, not the way Daniel had known him. Gone were the scuffed boots and faded work clothes. Instead, he wore a suit that probably cost more than Daniel's yearly wages, tailored perfectly to a posture that was no longer slouched with exhaustion, but straight, controlled, composed. The tired lines in his face remained, but now they were framed by something else, an air of power, of authority, of a man who was not just another worker, but the man who owned the entire building they stood in. Daniel froze. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The same man who had sat in the break room with a simple sandwich. The same man who had hesitated before accepting a piece of Daniel's lunch. The same man who had spoken little, observed much, and left with a quiet nod. Samuel Whitmore, the owner of Fulton Steel Factory. Daniel stood rigid, every instinct telling him that he didn't belong in this room, in this moment. Whitmore watched him carefully, then gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Daniel sat stiffly, his heart hammering against his ribs, his rough hands pressing against his knees as he struggled to keep himself from asking the thousands of questions swirling inside his head. Sam leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. He spoke, and his voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man who was exactly where he was meant to be. His full name was Samuel Whitmore, and this company, this factory, this empire of steel belonged to him. Daniel felt the words land like blows, not because they were harsh, but because they didn't make sense. This had to be a joke. Sam didn't pause. He kept speaking, as if sensing Daniel's disbelief. Every year, Sam explained, he went undercover. He stripped away his name, his wealth, his power. He stepped onto the factory floor not as an owner, but as a worker. He did this because he wanted to see the company through the eyes of the men who truly built it, the ones whose hands shaped the steel, whose sweat kept the machines running. Daniel remained silent, still trying to wrap his mind around it all. Sam leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but pointed. He had seen a lot the previous day. He had seen how people behaved when no one was watching. He had seen workers avert their eyes, avoid conversation, keep to themselves. He had seen selfishness, isolation. But Daniel? Daniel had shared his food. Daniel had shown kindness when he had no reason to. Daniel's throat tightened. It had been such a small thing, a simple gesture, nothing more. Sam's gaze didn't waver. It hadn't been small at all. Then the words that changed everything. Sam wanted men like Daniel leading his company. Daniel felt his entire world shift beneath him. He had walked into this office expecting reprimand, maybe even the loss of his job. Instead, he was being offered something he had never even dared to dream of. A chance, a future. A moment passed, the weight of it sinking in, and for the first time in 10 long years, Daniel didn't feel invisible. Daniel sat in stunned silence, his mind barely able to keep up with what was happening. Everything in his life had followed a clear, predictable path, routine, labor, exhaustion, repeat, but now, in the space of mere minutes, that cycle had been shattered. Across the desk, Samuel Whitmore, the man who had been sitting beside him just yesterday as an ordinary factory worker, watched him with calm certainty. The expensive suit, the polished desk, the sheer authority in the way he carried himself, it was all overwhelming. The world inside this office was so far removed from the brutal, sweat-drenched existence of the factory floor that Daniel felt like he had stepped into someone else's life. His hands rested on his knees, fingers gripping the fabric of his jeans as if to ground himself. The sounds of the factory, the pounding of metal, the rhythmic hiss of steam, the distant voices of men shouting orders over the machines, felt like they were a world away. Sam didn't rush him. He simply leaned back in his chair, studying him, waiting, as if he already knew how this conversation would end. Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to make sense of it all. He wasn't used to being noticed. He wasn't used to being singled out for anything other than another shift, another task, another obligation. Sam's voice cut through the haze of disbelief. He had read Daniel's file. Daniel felt his chest tighten. 10 years. 10 long years. He had walked into this factory every day for a decade, working the same machines, performing the same backbreaking labor. He had never once been late. He had never once asked for more than what was given. He had learned early on that speaking up didn't change anything. Men like him weren't meant for better positions. They were meant to endure. Yet now, in this moment, endurance had brought him here. Sam's words came without hesitation, firm, deliberate, final. Daniel had received no promotions, no recognition. That would change today. Daniel swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, as if speaking might crack the fragile balance of reality that was holding this moment together. His file. Someone had actually looked at it. Someone had actually noticed. His voice, when he finally managed to use it, felt foreign to him. He barely recognized it as his own. He struggled to force the words out. What did that mean? Sam didn't hesitate. A promotion, a supervisor position, better pay, better hours. Daniel felt his heart hammer against his ribs, the weight of it pressing against his chest like a force he couldn't contain. His thoughts raced in every direction at once, trying to process what this meant, trying to piece together the consequences, the possibilities. He thought of his family, his father, who had worked himself to the bone in a factory just like this one, and never had a single moment of relief. His brother, who had left town in search of something better and never looked back. The friends who had come and gone over the years, swallowed by the endless demands of labor, never given a way out. And then, he thought of himself, the years he had spent invisible, the exhaustion that clung to his bones, the long nights wondering if this was all there would ever be. He had always believed that hard work was enough, that if he just kept his head down, if he just kept pushing forward, something would change. But now, sitting in this chair, looking at the man across from him, he finally understood. It wasn't just about hard work. It was about who you were when no one was looking. He felt the weight of that realization settle into him, deeper than any exhaustion, heavier than any burden he had carried. His hands clenched slightly, fingertips pressing into his jeans as he tried to find something to anchor himself to. His mind still rebelled against the idea that this was real. He didn't deserve this, did he? Doubt crept in, slow but persistent. He wasn't the kind of man who sat in offices like this. He wasn't the kind of man who got promotions. He had spent too many years believing he would never be anything more than another name on a list, another worker in a sea of men who were just as easily replaced as the steel parts they built. Sam watched him closely, his expression unwavering. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. His voice came out quieter than he intended, thick with something he didn't know how to describe. He didn't know what to say. For the first time in a long, long time, words failed him. He had spent so many years accepting what was given, never daring to ask for more. Now, when the chance was finally placed in front of him, he didn't know how to take it. Sam leaned forward slightly, and for the first time since the conversation had started, he smiled. Not the polite, distant kind of smile he had worn before. This one was genuine, carrying with it an understanding that Daniel couldn't explain. Sam already knew what was going through his mind. He had seen doubt before. He had seen men hesitate, question whether they were worthy of something better. He had seen it in countless others who had sat in this very office, unprepared for what was being offered to them. But Sam didn't waver. He had made his decision. The only thing left was for Daniel to make his. The room felt smaller now, as if the air had thickened around him. His chest felt tight, his hands unsteady. Then Sam spoke again. There was no hesitation in his voice, only certainty. Say yes. Daniel inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of everything pressing against him, feeling the years of exhaustion trying to pull him back into the safety of what he had always known. He could say no. He could return to the factory floor, to the machines, to the life he had built with his own 2 hands. Or he could say yes. He could step into something unknown, something uncertain, something more. He looked at Sam, at the man who had once been just another factory worker in the break room, and felt something shift inside him. For the first time in his life, he let himself believe it was possible. And then, he did. The following week, Daniel Carter walked through the massive steel doors of Fulton's steel factory, but this time, he felt the weight of something different pressing against his chest. His usual work clothes, the faded denim, the worn-out boots, the grease-stained sleeves had been replaced. Now, his uniform was crisp, his boots polished, and clipped to his chest was a supervisor's badge. For 10 years, he had stepped onto the factory floor as just another worker, another name on the payroll. But today, everything had changed. He moved through the building with the same steady stride, but there was an undeniable shift in how the others looked at him. The air was thick with unspoken questions, silent judgments forming before he even had a chance to prove himself. Some of the men, the ones he had worked beside for years, greeted him with a nod of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of what this moment meant. Others, however, stood in tight clusters, their voices hushed, but their eyes tracking his every move. The whispers followed him like shadows, skepticism hanging in the air like smoke from the furnaces. They wondered how he had climbed the ladder so fast. He could feel their eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with doubt, and a few with outright resentment. Promotions didn't come to men like him. Promotions came to men with connections, with years of bending to the will of those in charge. Yet here he was, walking across the very same floor, where he had spent a decade grinding through long shifts with aching hands and tired bones. But Daniel didn't care about the rumors. He cared about the opportunity. He had spent years watching how things worked, how the system overlooked the very men who kept it alive. He had seen injuries ignored, workers pushed past their limits, men replaced the moment they became too slow, too old, too worn down. He had felt the weight of invisibility, the suffocating truth that no matter how hard he worked, he would always be just another worker. Until now. Now he could do something about it. He didn't waste time. His first few days were spent learning everything he could, not just about the new responsibilities, but about the men under him. He listened. He paid attention. He asked questions no other supervisor had ever asked. He fought for safety protocols, ensuring that faulty equipment wasn't just patched up with quick fixes, but properly repaired. He pushed for fair treatment, stepping in when he saw workers being overworked, refusing to let the quiet exploitation continue under his watch. He stood up for the men who had once stood beside him, making sure no one was treated as disposable. It wasn't easy. Resistance came quickly. Some of the higher-ups dismissed him as just another worker who had gotten lucky. Other supervisors resented his presence, viewing him as an outsider who hadn't earned his place the way they had. But Daniel didn't flinch. He did his job, and he did it the only way he knew how, with honesty, determination, and the same relentless work ethic that had carried him through a decade of struggle. He never used his new position as a shield. He didn't sit in an office, detached from the work below. When machines broke down, he was on the floor, sleeves rolled up, helping fix them. When men were struggling under the weight of endless shifts, he was there, making sure they got the support they needed. Slowly, the whispers began to fade. Respect replaced doubt. The men who had once questioned his sudden rise began to see him for what he was, not a man who had climbed the ladder through favors or shortcuts, but a man who had earned his place through something far rarer: integrity. One evening, as Daniel was leaving after another long shift, he caught sight of a familiar figure standing by the exit: Sam Whitmore. He wasn't dressed in the crisp, tailored suits that marked him as the owner of the company. Tonight, he stood in a simple jacket, hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable as he watched Daniel from across the room. Daniel approached, uncertain of what to expect. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The factory hummed in the background, the distant clang of machinery still echoing through the massive building, even as the workforce trickled out for the night. Then Sam gave a small nod of approval, his gaze steady, unwavering. Daniel knew what that meant. No long speeches, no unnecessary words, just understanding. He had earned this. He didn't need to be told. He knew it now. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Daniel felt something settle deep inside him. It had never been about wealth. It had never been about power. It had been a test of character, one that he had unknowingly walked into the moment he had chosen to share his lunch with a man he thought was just another worker. And now, standing at the edge of a future he had never imagined for himself, he understood the truth. Some men spent their lives chasing success. Others built it with their own hands. Daniel had done both, and he had passed. The story you just watched is fictional, created to highlight themes of humility, hidden identities, and the unexpected connections that can change lives. Its purpose is to raise awareness and inspire empathy in our daily interactions.